as a sort of recent shift in the Russian narrative of the Great Patriotic War. So let's start from the very beginning. Fall 1946, the Soviet Union, like other great powers, not very enthusiastic about Lemkin's proposal to put the crime of genocide on the UN General Assembly agenda and draft the Genocide Convention. In April 1948, Foreign Minister Molotov, blue pencil in hand, and Stalin, with red pencil in hand, added the draft Genocide Convention. And so they cross out all the things they don't like and add the things they would like to have in the Genocide Convention. So they cross out all the reference, Stalin in particular, references to international law, political groups, and international criminal future, international criminal court. It has been long assumed that Stalin meant the Great Terror of 1937-38 and the reference to the political group, but actually not. Circumstantial evidence is that he had in mind subjugation of Eastern Europe as a potential case that can be discussed as genocide. The mass murder of the Jews, as is well known, it's not at all featured in UN debates or a draft Genocide Convention. The Soviet display what I call defensive self-righteousness, arguing from the high moral ground. A Soviet representative in one of the sessions said, well, we know all about genocide because we experienced it firsthand. The argumentation also featured a good deal of cognitive dissonance. The Soviets are mentally blocking the thought that some of their features of the genocide they endorse or advance. For example, as we discussed yesterday, cultural genocide, or forcible transfer of people from one group to another, may actually apply to them. In any event, I would say that Stalin, by and large, got what he wanted with Genocide Convention. As you know, political groups have been omitted, and only vague reference to future ICC. He failed, however, to directly link genocide to Nazism and fascism. According to Stalin, I quote, "The crime of genocide is organically linked to fascism/Nazism in analogous racist theories that preach racial and ethnic hatred." Right after the convention had been passed in December 1948, the Soviets found themselves on the defensive. Neither the Soviet Union nor the United States did ratify the convention. Raphael Lemkin, in an effort to convince the Americans, jumped on the bandwagon of anti-communism, and he was the guy who variously promoted the notion of Soviet genocide, throwing anything and everything in this construct. It didn't work because the US was apprehensive of countercharges of genocide on account of mistreating African Americans. Stalin dies in 1953 and the Gulag is shortly dismantled. No one saw it coming when in May 1954 the Soviet Union suddenly ratified the Genocide Convention. Quite sudden it was not. The UN just finished investigation of forced labor, and the final report was rather toothless. It didn't mention China and basically slapped the Soviet Union on the wrist, so they kind of signed the relief and signed Genocide Convention. Throughout the Cold War period, the Soviet evoked genocide exclusively rhetorically. The Soviet scholarship on genocide essentially non-existent. There is a single doctorate thesis on the subject defended in 1954, and it appeared as a book in 1961. There is no really serious discussion in that book, and it's kind of propaganda if you look closely at it, as I did. As we know, there is many proxy wars between the communist and Western bloc going on in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and many of these wars becoming proxy wars of words. So any major conflict generated mutual accusation of genocide. Internationally, as we know, there are no formal indictments for genocide until after the end of the Cold War. For the Soviets, the closest call came in 1956, when Cuba filed a UN resolution charging the Soviet Union and communist bloc countries for genocide during the suppression of Hungarian Revolution. The Americans first came on board, but later backpedaled because they were not ready to give all-out support to Hungary, politically and also in legal respect. an interesting question. If I were teaching class, I would have thrown it to the audience. With a great number of instances during the Cold War labeled genocide, which particular case you think the Soviets evoked most persistently? Well, I won't wait for an answer. I looked what Pravda, the organ of Soviet Communist Party, wrote about genocide, any aspect of genocide between 1948 and 1988. And here comes a surprise. Well, not a surprise. Out of 1,137 articles were counted on just any aspect of genocide, 1/5 dealt with the Israel treatment of Palestinians. The first such references are from 1967, but they really took off in 1979, in particular after the Sabra and Shatila massacre in Beirut in September 1982. The Soviet propaganda machine then worked itself back in history, qualifying as genocide each preceding flare-up of violence, the Yom Kippur War, Six-Day War, the First Israel-Arab War, and finally the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. Why did the Soviets do it? Well, I would say that genocide propaganda came in lieu of substantive support to Yasser Arafat and PLO. The Soviet Union supported the PLO politically, yet refused to provide them with weapons. So that the talk is cheap, hence their genocide propaganda. By the way, if you're wondering what made it the top case of genocide for the Soviets besides Israel treatment of Palestinians, in a decreasing order, Pol Pot's Cambodia, mainly ex-post facto from late 1948, and mainly kind of charging China with treachery. The American war in Vietnam, El Salvador, and racial discrimination in the United States. Let me now move on to the subject of Holocaust discourse. Well, it's common knowledge that the Soviets denied the Jews the status of a specific group targeted by the Nazis for destruction. We discussed it a little bit yesterday, so they were considered part of the peaceful Soviet citizens. I would probably just add to that that as long as the Soviet propaganda presented Israelis as génocidaires par excellence, if you will, the Soviets were unlikely to promote the notion of the Jews as a preeminent victims of the Nazis. So basically the Soviets could not spell the words Jewish victims and genocide within a single sentence. Let me tell you just one representative anecdote. Karen Khachatуров, a Soviet official with a PhD in history in 1985, visits the ghetto fighters' house here in Haifa. He found quite a few shortcomings in the museum's permanent exhibition. He said the role of the Soviet army in the liberation of prison camps had been understated, while that of the Allied forces exaggerated. He objected to the use of the term Nazi and Nazism instead of Hitlerite and fascist. The documentary about the Jewish uprising in the Soviet war death camp, he noted, failed to mention the contribution of the Soviet prisoners of war. All of these things, according to Khachatуров, testified to the Zionist deliberate falsification of the causes of the Second World War and the origins of fascism with its ambiguous anti-communist and anti-Soviet streak. It comes of no surprise then that basically for the very first time the Soviet media described the Nazi destruction of the Jews as genocide literally 2 weeks before the August 91 coup, which marked basically the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. Okay, moving on to independent Russia. Throughout the 1990s, the public commemoration of the Holocaust in Russia went hand in hand with the revival of Jewish communal life. Again, there are many people in the audience who know to talk about it with more expertise than I. Boris Yeltsin, who by mid-1990s could barely hold on to power, was frantically searching for discursive threats in order to create sort of a new collective identity, and so the Great Patriotic War was obviously one of his themes. Going into Vladimir Putin's first presidential term, reference to the Holocaust in the context of the Great Patriotic War still remain far in between. Well, that began to change in the run-up to the celebration of the 60th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany in 2005. The first signs of things to come are from 2003. Before Russia began in earnest exporting its interpretation of the Second World War, it tested it here in Israel. Within the international setting, Putin referred to the Holocaust for the first time during the official visit of Israel Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to Russia in November 2003. Putin said that war veterans in Israel will be pleased to know that the Victory Museum in Moscow was putting together an exhibition on the Holocaust. When meeting with a group of Russian war veterans 2 weeks later, Putin compared questioning the leading role of the Soviet Union in the defeat of Hitler's Germany to Holocaust denial. So this is one of the emerging threats. Another semantic link that Putin has developed beginning in 2005 is a similar low status of Jews and Russians in certain post-Soviet countries. No surprise then, argues Putin, that Jewish organizations are among the first to react to the glorification of the Nazis and the German Waffen-SS in those unspecified countries. Taking cues from Putin, the Russian Foreign Ministry began molding the subject of the Holocaust into its agenda from about 2004. As its first target, it chose Latvia. Its core message was that Latvia exonerated war criminals in the run-up to joining NATO and the European Union and had maliciously promoted the comparison of mass crimes committed by the Nazis and Nazi and the Soviet regimes. In parallel, Russia has sponsored a resolution on the UN Commission for Human Rights that condemned the glorification of Waffen-SS as an expression of racial intolerance and xenophobia, which contravened both the Nuremberg judgment and the UN statute. In December 2005, Russia sponsored a UN General Assembly resolution which effectively restated that same message. Although the UN resolution didn't mention any country by name, the Russian permanent representative to the UN, the late Vitaly Churkin, confirmed to a Russian newspaper that they had specifically Latvia and Estonia in mind. Foreign Minister Lavrov in January 2007 linked that particular UN resolution with the new one passed by the UN on Holocaust denial. A Russian representative on the UN Committee of Information subsequently linked Holocaust denial and the removal of Soviet war memorials, monuments in Eastern Europe. The Foreign Ministry consistently expressed this idea, the belief that the international status of Russia can be further strengthened through the affirmation of the leading role of the Soviet Union in defeating Nazi Germany and liberating Europe. Since 2009, Russian authorities, Foreign Ministry in particular, also began co-opting Russian, or I would say pro-Russian Jewish organization into their designs. World Congress of Russian Jews, European Jewish Congress, and the World Without Fascism, Nazism organization run by Moshe Kantor, currently under US sanctions. So those organizations, for example, organize various roundtables on the lessons of Nuremberg, lessons of the Holocaust, lessons of the Second World War in European capitals, in UN headquarters. In December 2012, Russia sponsored yet another UN resolution, more explicit than that from 2005, and having glorification of Nazis in the title of the resolution. The voting pattern was the same for both resolutions. EU countries abstained, and Canada and US voted against. In 2014, Ukraine joined the US and Canada in the no vote, and immediately got a rebuke from Russia, which linked the subject of the Holocaust and that of resurgence of Nazism. Notably, this past spring, some of you might have noticed that the height of the campaign to denazify Ukraine, Russia once again reminded that Ukraine voted against the 2012 UN resolution. Let me diverge from my discussion for a moment by saying that in the context of Russian history politics, the year 2012 it was actually more important than the year 2014. That's when intergovernmental coordination on issues of history began in earnest. That's when two major proxy agencies, Alexander Alexander Medinsky, Russian Military Historical Society, and Sergei Naryshkin's Russian Historical Society came into existence. Why 2012? I think it's pretty obvious. That was kind of a reaction to anti-government protest in Russia, which came as a shock to the regime. So many things are happening in 2012, including President Putin unveiling so-called Victory Memorial here in Natanya. And his speech, Putin situated the Holocaust among Nazi crimes and praised the Red Army for saving Jews and many other peoples from obliteration. He then returned to his mantra of preserving the truth about the Second World War and preventing whitewashing Nazi accomplices. Putin raised this issue every time he's met with Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Half a year later, Putin was opening the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. There were many ethnicities in the Soviet Union who suffered at the hands of the Nazis, said Putin. The new museum would therefore serve as a memorial to both the murdered Jews of Russia and other victim groups. And please try to retain this Putin's construct, because I'm going to return to it in the last part of my presentation. I did the beginning of a concerted propaganda campaign by the Russian government to influence the international discourse on the Holocaust by 2015. That was always to do with a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty the previous year and the Western sanctions that followed. Putin spoke at a commemoration ceremony at Auschwitz-Birkenau in January 2005, but in 2015 the invitation was withdrawn. Instead of Auschwitz or Oswiecim, Putin paid a visit to the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. Putin's speech was a hodgepodge of references to anti-Semitism and Russophobia, nationalism and terrorism, lessons of history, and I quote, cold-blooded destruction of the peaceful population of Donbass. The point he was making is hard to miss. Bound by the tragic experience, Jews to join Russians in pushing back violent nationalism of the Ukrainian and Baltic kind, which is based on the exact same ideology that made the Holocaust possible. Russian representative at the OSCE the following years was contrasting purported Holocaust denial in the Baltic countries and Ukraine with a comprehensive Holocaust remembrance program in Russia, and he had a long list. Sites of mass murder marked, and a school holds Holocaust history lessons, a center for Holocaust and genocide studies, the one headed by Ilya Altman, has been established at the Russian State University for the Humanities, and so on. So the emerging narrative is really, at this point, is the Red Army bringing salvation to Jews and East European nations, while Jews were not just the victims of the Nazis, but also made a contribution to Soviet victory over Nazi Germany by means of serving within the ranks of the Red Army. The thrust of the Russian 2018 blockbuster Sobibor, director starring Alexander Habensky, is effectively the same. The imprisoned Soviet military officer Alexander Pechersky, who just happened to be Jewish, led Jews to revolt against the Nazi tormentors' Sobibor death camp, making it the first such uprising to ever happen, according to the Soviets. The movie and the massive promotional campaign by the Russian state is a fascinating subject in its own right. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss it, but we'll happily take it up in question and answers if you're waiting. Anyway, the film was nominated for Oscar in the category of Best Foreign Film. It didn't get it. And very interesting is since then, the whole kind of discourse on the Holocaust of this international dimension kind of died out in Russia. However, as we know, we should not underestimate Putin, and so he had another kind of, Putin's regime had another card of the sleeve. Currently, they again are sort of offensive within the field of history politics. This time it's a legal offensive, and the key word is genocide. They have such bodies called Victory Organizing Committee. It's kind of intergovernment advisory board that has to do with everything related to the Second World War, including so-called patriotic education, and specifically marking the Victory Day, May 9th. So the Victory Organizing Committee held a regular meeting in the Kremlin in December 2018. One of the speakers, Yelena Tsarnaeva, head of the Russian Search Movement, that's an organization that looking for the remains of the fallen Soviet soldiers and trying to identify them. In her presentation, she identified the problem of exhuming mass graves containing civilian victims, which the current legislation doesn't provide for, she noted. As example, she referred to the sites of Nazi mass murder at Zhelezная Gorka in Novgorod region and Moklino in Pskov region. Many perpetrators of those atrocities belonging to Estonian, Latvian, and Ukrainian Waffen-SS division escaped just punishment by having fled to the West and are currently celebrated as heroes in their respective countries, she said. According to Tsarnaeva, mass crimes committed on the German-occupied Russian territory attest to genocide, not just of the Jews, but also of the Slavs. She thought it was important to raise this issue from both political and pedagogical points of view. The Russian Search Movement was doing it by means of a new large-scale project called без срока давности, with no statute of limitations. In order to identify perpetrators and hinder the glorification of all criminals, Tsarnaeva hoped to secure the cooperation of the Russian Historical Society, Sergei Naryshkin, former intelligence chef, and the Russian Investigative Committee, that's Alexander Bastyrkin. Putin endorsed the project, which formally launched in March 2019, financed through presidential grants. However, at this point, it was still not entirely clear as to what is the ultimate objective and what's the legal framework. Things came to a head in early May of that year. On May 9th, the Latvian parliament proclaimed the Soviet deportation of Crimean Tatars in 1944 an act of genocide, and it reaffirmed non-recognition of the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. In response, Russian legal authorities opened a criminal investigation into the murder of civilians in the village of Zhelezная Gorka, carried out by the SS Einsatzgruppe subunit, composed mainly of ethnic Latvians. So in October 27, 1920, a local court qualified as genocide, thus creating a legal precedent in Russia. The court found that the Nazis intended, I quote, completely destroy the Soviet people, including the Slavic ethnic group who live on the territory of occupied Leningrad, Pskov, and Novgorod regions. Then Minister of Culture, head of the Russian Military Historical Society, Alexander Medinsky, praised the verdict, arguing that the affirmation of genocide would automatically cancel the thesis according to which the Soviet Union shares responsibility with Nazi Germany for the unleashing of the Second World War. So according to Medinsky, the Soviet people were both the victims in the war against the Nazi Germany, the victors in the war against Nazi Germany, but also the victims of the Nazi genocide. President Putin and Prosecutor General of Russia, Igor Krasnov, who partook in the Forum Lessons of Nuremberg the following month, both positively commented on the genocide verdict. Krasnov informed of further 6 criminal cases, similar to that at Novgorod, presented presently in the works. Eventually, he said the investigation would, into wartime atrocities under the heading of genocide would be extended onto 22 Russian regions. So Prosecutor General also proposed reintroducing the term genocide into the Russian legislation, this time specifically in connection with the Second World War. According to him, such a legislative initiative would have important international ramifications, guarding against the false representation of the Soviet Union in the Second World War. In August 2020, the investigative committee launched a criminal investigation into atrocities committed at Moglino concentration camp in Pskov region, and a year later, Pskov court dutifully established the fact of genocide. This time around, the SS subunit implicating the crimes was subordinated to the German security police in Tallinn and had a number of ethnic Estonians among its ranks. Again, in March 1921, the investigative committee brought 20 plus pending genocide cases into a single criminal investigation. Bastyrkin justified this decision by the bulk of newly uncovered evidence, which purportedly points to the total destruction of the civilian population of the Soviet republics. Since the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, an avalanche of new genocide cases followed, as if by coincidence, many of them take place in the region bordering Ukraine. Rostov-on-Don, Krasnodar, also occupied Crimea. So those are very remarkable cases, and for the following reasons. First, all of these atrocities have since long been known. Железная Горка was the subject of a trial in Novgorod in 1947 and Pskov in 1967. The KGB investigated the crimes committed at Krasnodar in 1970. Says Bastyrkin, I quote, "The investigative committee has established the fact of mass murder of 27,000 Soviet citizens, mainly Jews, at Zmeyovsky Gorge in Rostov-on-Don." Well, wait a second. What does he mean by has established? The Soviet Extraordinary State Commission has documented the massacres at Rostov-on-Don as early as 1943. What about the figure 27,000 quoted by both the Commission and Investigative Committee? Well, that's the number of Jews in the city of Rostov according to the 1939 Soviet census. And this figure, of course, doesn't account for those Jews who managed to evacuate or escape, those who were conscripted in the Red Army, and those few who survived in hiding. Obviously, neither the Soviet nor present Russian legal authorities are bothered about such details. Second, no new evidence is forthcoming. Indeed, the police began interviewing few survivors, for example, in Volgograd. However, Russia being Russia, interviews were conducted interrogation style. A veteran organization, local veteran organization, voiced its concern. The presidential administration in Moscow got wind of it and subsequently recommended discontinuing this practice. The Russian search movement doing their excavations. So, for example, they exhumed the remains of 500 people murdered at Moglino site. The verdict of the Pskov Regional Court, however, still uses a solid figure to 2,600, which is five times larger. So obviously, Russian authorities are actually not interested in reviewing new evidence. Officials like Medinsky and Bastyrkin make a case for genocide by referring to high, uncorroborated numbers of the murdered Soviet civilians. So according to Medinsky, it is up to 18 millions, according to Bastyrkin, 20 millions. So if, say, forensic expertise contradict the commonly accepted Soviet figures, and those figures, as some of you may know, have been established in the 1940s, 1950s by extrapolation, basically, then the genocide argument collapses. Third, very curiously, there are no convictions. The court provides no new names of the alleged perpetrators. Well, it's obvious why. They're all dead. There was just one name on the list, Helmut Oberlander, who escaped at the 1950s, first to Germany and then to Canada. Canada tried to deport him for 15 years to Germany, but he died in September 2021. Another thing is that the investigative committee, the courts, and that Tsonaiver's research movement, they all repeatedly emphasize that genocide has no statute of limitations, which is true. That's, of course, true insofar as genocide had been committed after January 12, 1951. That is when the Genocide Convention came into force. Genocide can be prosecuted retroactively, at least, not according to the Russian law. So, nullum crimen sine lege. Fourth, without supplying any new evidence, the ongoing criminal investigation does nothing to increase our knowledge about those specific atrocities or the Nazi mass murder generally. And finally, we learn absolutely nothing from these court proceedings about the phenomenon of genocide. The cases are being handled by local provincial courts, which don't possess expertise in international law. it doesn't help that Russia, after the aggression against Ukraine in 2014, was consistently withdrawing from international legal cooperation, international bodies, most recently the European Court of Human Rights. So the irony is that the local courts pronounce genocide verdicts but don't dwell on interpretation or application of Genocide Convention general or specific provisions. So, if we consider four major objectives of criminal investigation, Russian genocide court cases fulfill none. To determine whether a crime has been committed. Now, that's been done before. To determine whether, to legally obtain evidence. Well, nothing new. To identify and apprehend individuals involved in the crime. Been done earlier. To assist in the prosecution of persons charged with a crime. Not have been done. So what's then the purpose of reopening old war crime cases and reclassifying as genocide? Well, the purpose is obviously political, rhetorical, and ideological. What's on trial is really history or interpretation of history. I want to add, do I have a few more minutes?
Yes.
Yeah. That this is kind of coordinated, multifaceted campaign of which court cases is just a part. Beginning in 2021, on April 19 of each year, educational institutions across Russia hold an event called the Day of Unified Action in memory of the genocide of the Soviet people committed by Nazis and their collaborators during the Great Patriotic War. Why April 19th? Well, on that day in 1943, I think it was mentioned yesterday, the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union issued a decree providing for the persecution of Nazi war criminals and spies and traitors among the Soviet population. Like many other Russian memorial dates and federal outreach projects, the Day of Unified Action advances the notion of historical truth and prepares the younger generation to spot historical falsifications. The overall message is that the Soviet people rallied around the Red Army to avoid annihilation. If you're wondering why Russian authorities pick specifically April 19th of all other dates, well, April is packed with memorial dates internationally. April 7th, commemoration of Rwanda genocide. Yom HaShoah falls on April 18th next year. April 24th, commemoration of Armenian genocide. In American universities, they have sometimes the whole kind of Genocide Awareness Month, which happened again in April. So I can almost picture...
Like in Israel.
Yes. Can picture political technologists, poring over the calendar in Moscow, said, oh, April fits well. Let's put our genocides also up there. On January 27th of this year, the Moscow Regional Association of Former Underage Victims of Fascism approached President Putin with the proposal to formally recognize the genocide of the Soviet people and introduce respective commemorative date. As we know, January 27 marks the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. In Russia, however, it is presently identified as the day of commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau by the Red Army. In parallel, it's also marked lifting the siege of Leningrad, which, as Olga mentioned yesterday, conveniently in October 2021 was proclaimed by a Russian court genocide. United Russian politicians and interviewed historians all came in support of the initiative, yet there were also a few voices of dissent, for example, by a liberal lawyer and Ilya Altman of the Russian Holocaust Center. The invasion of Ukraine the following month apparently put this particular initiative on hold, and I haven't come any further references to this particular initiative. So to conclude, in many respects, the Russian discourse on the Holocaust and genocide is not fundamentally different from the old Soviet, yet there are also substantial differences. The present reference of Nazi mass crimes by Russian authorities marked by A, cynicism, B, coordination across the government, C, the efforts to insert a sort of pseudo-victimization efforts, if you will, into the dominant narrative of military heroism, and D, more pronounced cognitive dissonance, which penetrates actually all aspects of life in Putin's Russia. When it comes to the Holocaust, the Putin regime evokes it basically in just two instances: collaboration in Nazi mass murder of Jews in Eastern Europe, and or the Soviet contribution to putting an end to Nazi genocide. As Russian historian Pavel Polan has sarcastically remarked, I quote, 6 million Jews, by fact of having been murdered by fascists, became Russia's allies in the fight against neo-fascism. The Putin regime approaches criminal law and history in the same fashion it does all other aspects of governance. What we're seeing is basically a manifestation of zero-sum thinking that dictates that the winner takes it all. The Nazis, having arguably committed genocide against the entire Soviet people, somehow absolves Russia of all injustices it had committed throughout history against its own population and its neighbors. The Kremlin political technologists appear to sincerely believe that the self-bestowed status of a victim of genocide automatically erases scenes past and present and endows Russia with moral superiority. The train of thought exposes the ignorance and, frankly, unprofessionalism. The present Russian genocide discourse falls on deaf ears, both domestically and internationally, if it's known at all. The term and application of genocide remained peripheral in the post-1991 Russia, sort of dumping the legal concept of genocide on an expected public, effectively making it another buzzword in the so-called patriotic education, all within the last 3 years, tells me that the Russian state propaganda is running out of ideas. Introducing a mere 3 years ago the construct of genocide over Soviet people by the Nazis and their collaborators, and almost immediately linking it to the claim of 8 years of Ukrainian genocide in Donbass as a pretext for invasion of sovereign nation, discredits both. So the now effectively terminated government campaign that focused on the Holocaust suggests a similar fate for the construed genocide narrative. Thank you.